Hello once again everyone, so a bit of a bonus video for you this week before we get into the regular exercises. So last time we went over the shoulder, elbow, and wrist cuts with the longsword, and a special request by Mr. Matthew Willliams was, could you show these same things from below? So I'm just going to rattle through them relatively quick, and this will be a pretty short series. So basically the idea here is everything I said before in regards to your point of activation, etc. is still going to be true. I'm going to show it first without movement, then I'll show it with movement, and we'll just kind of talk through as we go. So I'll start with the shoulder cuts. So generally what I recommend for you for this is, if you're starting it stagnantly, we're going to need to let our feet move. Reason being is that when you're cutting from above, your shoulders have not a lot of difficulty activating because it's from above, that's where your shoulders can reach, right? When I cut from below, instead, to really get the most out of my shoulders, I'm getting more from my torso and hips. So what I'll do is I'll start above my head, and I'll bring it down here, letting my feet turn so that everything's kind of loaded on this side. Then I'm going to pull and push with my hands so that I cut up and through. Now, where there should be is I could either choose to come down to the other side, or I could terminate over on my left shoulder. It's kind of up to you, but for our purposes, we're going to go ahead and go through. So I will load, cut, bring it down, cut. And this is just me using my shoulders and my core more than anything else to achieve this cut. And so if I want to combine these now with my overcuts, down, up, down. And we see it's a very similar sort of motion. It's just a question of whether or not you finish low or go back to the shoulder. So I'll show that from the side, and then we'll get to movement. So here, over, up, over, up, over, up, over, up. And I'm not working all that hard with my arms. In fact, this, even more so than a cut from above, feels like it does nothing to my arms. It's just that core letting those arms extend. Now, when you combine this with movement, whenever you're doing a cut from below, it's important to remember that gravity isn't assisting you, it's actually hampering you. So what you really need to focus on is, if you can't guarantee that your sword is going to be directly in front of your head when you finish your motion, which we'll get to again with the two cut, instead you must supplement that by moving laterally. Basically, if I can, I would like for my cuts, all of my cuts, but especially from below because it's more apparent, to end up with my schilt, my strong, blocking where your sword is going to come from directly. So less about wedging the middle and much more about just closing off a line. If I can't guarantee that, such as with a through cut, then I'm going to do my best to add enough distance that by the time you could reach me, your cut is running out of effectiveness, and also give myself more time to adapt once my cut finishes. So basically, step wide, it helps guard your head. So with that in mind, we start up above, I bring it down, big cut through. Big cut through. And you notice I like to stay upward, especially on my left side. This is a motion I do actually quite a bit. But that idea of just load, through, and usually these, if you're doing a through cut from below, you're usually not going to do a second one. It's going to end up as you terminating into a high guard, as these are most often employed as a deflection or as a cut that you leave with. So just another example wherein I do a through cut in particular is sometimes I'll find myself forward, I will turn over and do a through cut as I put myself onto my back leg. That'd be an example of that. But either way, that's how you do your through cuts from below. Now we'll get specifically through cuts with the shoulder. Now we'll get into the two cuts with the elbow. Now, this is going to feel not like it involves your elbow all that much. Like if shoulder cuts didn't necessarily feel like it involved your shoulder and more borrowed from the hip, this is more borrowing from the chest, I would say. So essentially what we're going to do is, like I talked about before, if we're not going to be using wide lateral pressure to keep ourselves safe, instead we have to make sure that wedge happens. And specifically our wedge is less about the middle and much more about where their sword is coming from. So for this, I recommend, once again, go ahead and go down into basically name, node, cut along, go, whatever. And the idea here is my cut is direct. So it's going to look very similar to the cut I was doing before, but the whole purpose of this is extension, and I bring it down, extension, and I bring it down, extension. Now I'm pretty much cutting, everything's activating the same as it was for my shoulder cut, but it's a little bit gentler, and it's going to have that aspect of I am focusing on getting out here where it protects me and keeping lined up with that. As such, this one usually feels a little better with movement. So, show that with movement, same idea. I am down, up. I am down, up. And I'm really setting myself behind these each time. I'll do it from the side here. So I'm down, up, and down, up, and down, up, and down, up. These are going to usually be a bit more tip cutty, but the benefit is you get a nice strong guard afterwards. So that's how you do your elbow cuts from below. Next, and important on that, extension. You are, just like we talked about before, I don't need to stop this cut. I am cutting out and it will naturally terminate. The same thing is true here. It's just you are terminating out here. So my tip is going into space and naturally my arms will stop because I didn't add any, it didn't take anything from my hips really, right? Like I said, this is more my chest is pushing this forward as opposed to me borrowing from the hip for a swing through. Either way though, now we come to wrist cuts. So for wrist cuts, the basic idea here is, number one, you actually get to start tip forward, like fully forward. You start here, and we're going to pull our tip back and basically make a full circle as it cuts through. Now you can do this in two ways. Since we're just doing a wrist cut, I'm going to break one of my more common habits. So essentially, like I said, whenever you cut from below, you gotta be worried about guarding your head. Normally, I will not let this hand relax for sake of tip acceleration. Because while that gets a quick cut, this does not keep my head safe. Normally what you'll see from me is this, but that is me using a wrist transition into an elbow cut. So for our purposes, we're gonna go ahead and let that turn through, which immediately turns over into another one. Then it'll just kind of naturally turn from side to side. It's really hard not to get your hips into this particular one because it just flows so well. But again, you're just pretty much doing the same exact thing that we did from above, whereas my pommel is making a figure 8 pattern. It's just going to feel the other way. Now, what you do need to make sure when you're practicing this, one, it is all about just building supplety of the wrists, focusing on your offhand doing all the work. Two, make sure your cut is actually still crossing through the same place in space. So what we don't want to see is this, whereas you notice my cuts aren't necessarily going through the same central place, they're kind of going wherever. I'm looking at the camera right now, specifically, well, the camera's never seen it, but I have a sticker on the back of my phone. That's what I'm looking at right now. It's about the size of a coaster. I am looking at that point, and when I do these cuts, I'm making sure that my cuts are going through that target as much as possible. Now, without movement, and you notice that's why my hips want to turn, it's decently difficult to get that alignment because you're coming from below. As such, you want to instead turn your body, which lines up your cut a little more since you're turning more profile. Now when we have the feet into it, everything's going to feel a little bit better. So for this, we're going to go ahead and start left foot forward like we did before. So I'm going, well, you could do this right forward with no step. We'll do it that. We'll keep same footwork. So cut, no step, cut with step, and then we're just through, okay? Now, you could, in theory, do a 2 cut with your wrist. In theory, what that would be this, just the extension of the pommel. So in theory, if you want to, you could boom, boom, out, out. But really, I mean, it is beneficial, so I'll go ahead and describe how I do it. I will say though, I don't necessarily find this flows as well as practicing them from above, but I digress. So the idea here is, you cut through. On your next separation, you're going to take your lead hand, push it more to middle, almost kind of go into a hanging guard, then squeeze with the pommel, and that's what's going to get you a little bit of tip acceleration. You again line yourself up, then you extend. So, through, line, pop. And it is a small thing, but it is good to know how to do. In particular, this motion is less about cutting and much more about the idea of when someone is moving up your blade, try and stick you or something along those lines, this gets your tip engaged, which lifts that whole action a significant amount. This can also come in handy for some windings, wherein I've got a bind that's not quite what I need, but not enough that I need to turn over, so I squeeze and I can get that tip acceleration in there. Well, tip level, rather. So I suppose it is useful, but it's going to come up less commonly, at least in this context. Now, I'll do that with movement, and I'll do it facing this way, because I have to face this way ahead. So, same idea as before. Through, through cut, through cut, two cut, two cut, through cut, through cut, two cut, two cut. And it's just that squeeze at the end. I'm lining up, firing. So, what about comboing these together like we did last time? Well, there are some things you can do, but most all of them are going to feel better comboing from low into high. You might fight from above twice. It's relatively rare, not in regards to like practicality, but more in regards to what you're going to naturally want to do, to fight from below twice. So instead, what is more common is generally you're going to find situations where, for example, I start with a nice through cut, boom, I turn over, now I'm up into my shoulders from above, out into the rest of that pattern. Alternatively, you may find you have one of your cuts get stopped. So for example, I cut from above, through, I turn over, up, and I get that nice solid extension. And then from here I could lead into a bunch of different things, but usually again, above will be the next thing. Because generally when you cut from below, while you can open its opposite quadrant, it's just not going to be quite the same, and generally there's going to be a juicier option on one of the high lines. So by all means play around with it, but you're going to find that, especially with a little bit of training under your belt, your tendencies are going to move toward, I want to go up rather than I want to go low again. So, but practice them because they are very good motions. So either way, that's how we do our shoulder, elbow, and wrist cuts with our through and two cuts, and a little bit about comboing them together. Hopefully this was helpful, and otherwise, thank you very, very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.